Hey guys, it's Celestia, and I've always been a huge fan of horror. I've said this many times before, and this is far from the first time that passion has made its way into my content. From deep diving into horror manga to analyzing the controversial art of certain pieces of analog horror media, I'm pretty much always looking for new excuses to sneak my love for the genre into my art commentary. It's not hard, in fairness, given how often art plays a significant role in the success or failure of a piece of horror media. An overlap that I'm deeply grateful for because it enables my desperate desire to indulge my special interest in horror while still staying within my channel's niche. It's not something I do often because I realize that not everyone shares that interest, but it's spooky season. It's Halloween. Hopefully the actual day of it if this goes up on time. It's the one month of the year where I have a socially acceptable excuse to gush about horror art, and I don't think there's a single thing on earth powerful enough to stop me from taking it. And what better topic to discuss during the season of horror than an artist that was allegedly cursed by his own art, to the point that he quit his career as a mangaka and an artist after it almost killed him. Not from overworking like so many others in the industry, but from a series of mysterious and unexplainable events that seemed to occur whenever he tried to draw the story that he started with his manga, Koisho Radio. At least, that's what the headlines would have you believe, with articles titled everything from "Manga artist quits his career to stay alive after allegedly being haunted," to "Horror manga artist had to quit drawing after creepy incidents started happening to him." It's certainly the narrative that Western media has been most fond of spreading. But beneath the sensationalized clickbait and misreporting, stemming mostly from the Japanese to English language barrier, lies a story a lot more nuanced and interesting than any of those rumors suggest. One in which finding the truth at the bottom of it is not just difficult, but potentially impossible, especially because that truth may lie with the supernatural after all. So in today's video, I'm going to deep dive into Masaaki Nakayama, the mangaka and horror artist whose work gained notoriety not only for its disturbing, haunting subject matter and art style, but also for the allegedly real haunting that Nakayama was subjected to so consistently whenever he tried to work on it that he had to leave that very manga unfinished for his own health and safety. We'll discuss the myths, the facts, and even the role the manga story itself plays in his reported supernatural experiences, and hopefully get to the bottom of this mystery and find the answer to a question that's been asked by the community for years. Was this mangaka truly cursed by his own art? Before we do though, I'd like to give a few quick warnings. Koisho Radio is a manga that depicts a great deal of detailed and visually disturbing body horror, and while there's very little actual gore and none that is present in the manga will be shown in this video, the manner in which Nakayama distorts and disfigures the human form is both exceptional and viscerally unsettling, enough that it may disturb more sensitive viewers. And not only will I be showing a significant number of examples of his art, I'll also be drawing art inspired by it in the speed paint, which will also depict a similar degree of body horror. Again, no blood or gore, but body horror nonetheless, and I know that's not something everyone is comfortable with, so if you're not, here's your warning to either turn this video off, or just give it a listen without looking at the visuals. You'll still get the gist of the story without them. Also, if you haven't read Koisho Radio yet and are interested in doing so, I would recommend doing that first. It's linked in the description. While I cut the majority of this video script that deep dives into an explanation of the plot because I figured that maybe 2 entire people would be interested in that, there will still be some spoilers mentioned in this video, and I wouldn't want them to ruin the reading experience for you. That in mind, let's get started with some background on the artist himself. Masaaki Nakayama is an artist that's been working as a mangaka since 1990, winning multiple awards for his stories and art alike, and earning a great deal of notoriety within Japan for his eerie, jarring, unsettling plots and equally disturbing and incredibly detailed artwork. The most popular of his works is easily Fuan no Tane, or Seeds of Anxiety, an impressive and ongoing manga that's very well known and just as well loved by Japanese fans, even though its lack of official English translation has left it unfortunately obscure amongst Western readers. What is significantly less obscure amongst Western readers, however, is the subject of today's video, the manga that earned him international acclaim, Koisho Radio. Also known as PTSD Radio or After Effects Radio, it's a story that is, at first, disjointed to the point of incomprehensibility. It depicts short, jarring vignettes of characters that we often don't even follow long enough to learn the names of, as they experience horrors so inexplicable and disturbing that they rival those of Junji Ito, depicted with art so detailed and shocking that it's both beautiful and revolting all at once. And while this method of quickly switching between jump scare riddled short stories that appear unrelated can strike some as off-putting or hard to follow, it's an intentional choice, one that's exemplified in the name itself. It's a radio, and with stories marked by frequencies rather than uniformly and chronologically numbered chapters, we're not supposed to read it like we would read a book. We're supposed to read these stories like we're hearing them through the world's most demented radio that's constantly switching stations, with each narrative being cycled through too quickly and abruptly for us to make any sense of them. On the surface, it appears as if we're being shown the same thing over and over again. A character we don't know is going about their daily life when something inexplicable and terrifying happens to them, usually involving a great deal full of hair, deformity, and body horror. Then, without explanation or conclusion, the chapter ends and we're introduced to a new character to whom the same cycle repeats, leaving many readers feeling as if it's just a series of unexplained and unrelated events that are just supposed to deliver cheap scares with no underlying story more significant than that. And while the disjointed manner in which the story is told leaves first-time readers with every right to feel like there is no story at all, that's a false assumption even if it's a reasonable one. The chaos that makes the narrative so difficult to follow is not, in fact, a flaw, but a feature. We're supposed to feel like there's no sense or explanation or reason to be found within the short stories that we're being shown, leaving us with the desolate and terrifying cosmic horror of being helpless to understand how or why these awful, inexplicable things are happening. That's one of the most unique and fascinating aspects of Koisho Radio. Whether you're lost in that chaos and unable to make sense of any underlying narrative the stories share, or you're dedicated to putting the pieces together and solving the mystery of the world's lore, you're reading it right. You're experiencing it just as Nakayama intended you to, no matter what that means for you. In an interview with Anime News Network, he explained, "You can read the chapters as individual vignettes, as a single connected story, or you can discern certain linear principles behind the ordering. I was careful to make sure that none of those readings was extraneous. I didn't think at all about including any elements of a mythos. Make the reader imagine. That was everything." And truly, Koisho Radio's ability to terrify us with our own imaginations is one of its most praiseworthy strengths. For some, it's scarier to have no idea how or why the horrors it depicts are unfolding, because it lets our minds run wild with all of the possible explanations without any canonical explanation to hold that speculation back. For those readers, the scariest truth to them is the truth of the story, because there's no concrete narrative confirmed by the manga or its author to say it isn't, which is precisely why it's effective. But while Koisho Radio's deliberate ambiguity serves its purpose well, we have to both acknowledge and completely disregard its value to dig deeper anyway, and uncover the mystery of its artist's real-life curse, which is why I felt the context to be important enough to include in a video about just that. While there's no canonical reading order, as Nakayama confirmed himself in that interview, he did also confirm that while any interpretation can be viewed as correct without limiting them solely to the one that he intended when writing it, you can still discern linear principles behind the ordering of the chapters. And once you do, you see Koisho Radio in an entirely new light, one that might explain how the underlying story beneath the chaos relates to the mysterious events that Nakayama really experienced while drawing it. Read in the order in which they're presented, Koisho Radio's chapters tell the story of tens of unrelated individuals in incredibly different time periods experiencing unrelated horrors for no discernible reason. Most stories involve similar themes of characters being tormented by hair in one way or another, having it pulled by invisible forces, being told to cut it for their safety, having it explode out of their eyes and mouths, being entirely enveloped into a cocoon of it, being haunted by creatures almost entirely made of it. But without a linear narrative to follow, we can't understand why. When we read those frequencies in what I believe to be the correct order, however, we can. Reading them chronologically, with the lowest frequencies happening the longest time ago and the highest frequencies happening the most recently, it tells a very clear story, the story of a curse, not at all dissimilar to the one Nakayama himself claims to have experienced. These aren't random stories from random time periods happening to random people. Everything is happening in the same city that was once an ancient village that worshipped a god of hair that they called Ogushi-sama, and everything the people in that village and now city are experiencing ties back to that god and its curse. Starting at the earliest frequencies, we see that ancient village from long, long ago, in which the residents still actively and reverently worship this god, treating it with the utmost respect, something it seems to reward. Even so, it's introduced quite early on that despite its occasional benevolence, this god does not care about right and wrong, something that's reiterated time and time again throughout the manga. As one character puts it, as far as gods are concerned, blessings and curses are two sides of the same coin after all. The whims of the divine cannot be measured by humans' petty sense of good and evil. Morality is not a concept that interests the gods, according to Koisho Radio and its cast. And while Ogushi-sama did use its power to guide lost children home, it also allowed a village woman to use its power to kill several other residents, hanging them with hair. It appears that Ogushi-sama does not seek to punish or reward humans based on right or wrong, but based on the respect or lack thereof that they show it. As time passes and the village moves into the modern era, however, Ogushi-sama is mostly forgotten, gradually fading into irrelevance. The once well-maintained statue of it falls into almost unrecognizable disrepair, a poignant visual representation of how the village outgrew its love and respect for the god over time, as it developed into what's now a bustling modern city with no place left for old traditions and superstitions. And as you might guess, that's not a development the god takes kindly to. A team is sent to move its statue, and the first worker to attempt to do so has his head inflate and explode, falling to the ground dead before the ominous statue. When the village people approach the chief priest demanding the statue be destroyed because there's no longer a need for old religions and traditions, seeking to develop the land it's on and grow the village instead, the first one to try to do so, well, you can see what happens to him, as the chief priest watches in horror, wondering if the statue that once protected them, now emanating pure darkness, is responsible. And it's pretty clear that he's exactly right. Even the most seemingly random, unconnected events can all be traced back to that same source, the god of hair, and its increasingly prolific and widespread wrath against a city that's that's forgotten it. Initially, it appears as if only those who are being punished for something suffer its curse. It's a recurring theme throughout the manga that those who wrong each other or Oguchi-sama are cursed to pay the price for it, suggesting that those who experience the god's wrath have done something to someone to earn it. But as the frequencies rise in number and time passes, it becomes clearer that the truth is much less comforting. If the curse were a punishment, we could at least take solace in the idea that those who do nothing wrong have nothing to fear. The innocent would be safe. But more and more often, we're reminded of what we've been told so many times already. This god has no interest in morality. It has no concept of innocence or guilt, and when its power is used to punish the guilty rather than simply those that disrespect it, it's almost always only because another human being harnessed it to do so. Oguchi-sama doesn't seem to care whether those it hurts have done something wrong, but will curse them regardless if it's called upon by a human to do so. Worse, that curse seems equally indiscriminate in its manner of transmission. It appears as if simply interacting with a person or item that's cursed is enough to effectively catch it. And as more and more people in the city fall victim to this seemingly contagious curse, it spreads further and further with more victims passing it along. Having long since forgotten the ancient village's traditional method to sever the hair that ties the cursed to the god, they're almost completely helpless to escape that connection, one through which it's able to torment them with hair over and over again. While all of this is purely my interpretation, I feel that it's abundantly clear that every story told in Koisho Radio is connected. In fact, the characters in one story even suggest as much to us. They share similar accounts of stories that they had heard about local legends. And in what might be the most meta way possible of acknowledging the manga's own plot, they posit that it's possible that all of their different stories are in some way related. And while I can't say for sure that the interpretation I just presented is accurate, I can say that in researching this video, I filled an entire notebook with every single connection each story had to one another, and went full-blown conspiracy theorist, Shane, I've connected the dots, Madej.
I've connected the two dots.
You didn't connect shit, but
I've connected them.
To the point that I could do a deep dive video on this story that would be at least 3 hours long, so I'm fairly confident that at least most of it is correct. Honestly, it caused me physical pain not to explain it all right here, and I had to cut 3 pages of this script where I tried to, but I know that's not what you're here for. You're here to find out what the hell all of this has to do with the real artist ending up hospitalized and near death as what may be a result of drawing it. And I'm sorry it took so long for me to get there, but there's a reason it did. Not only is the plot of the manga related to it, it literally depicts it. In the third volume, Nakayama begins interspersing the stories of this cursed city with his own. Through brief interludes where he speaks directly to readers and illustrates his real experiences, we're shown that the curse of Oguchi-sama may be based more on truth than fiction. And not only has that truth seemingly inspired the story of Koisho Radio, Nakayama appears to have faced dire consequences by trying to tell it. That in mind, let's take a closer look at his account of those allegedly true events as it was presented in the manga, starting with his old office, the place that might be responsible for it all. It's a building he found when moving from Tokyo to Sapporo, and decided to rent it as his new office space for manga production after being pleasantly surprised at how great of a deal on rent it was compared to the vastly more expensive real estate in Tokyo. Oddly though, despite that enticingly affordable price tag, the building was almost completely empty. In a 4-floor building with 7 units, the only tenants were Nakayama, his landlord, and an unnamed company that closed in the evening. Perhaps that should have been a red flag warning of things to come, but I doubt anyone could have anticipated the strange occurrences that would soon follow as he and his team settled into the building. Shortly after making the new space their own, Nakayama found an object wrapped in paper in the storage space above a closet. Unwrapping it revealed that it was a kamidana, or a home shrine, something that's used in the Shinto religion as a place of daily worship and prayer for household blessings. These are quite common in Japanese homes, and finding one left behind isn't necessarily surprising, but the one Nakayama discovered in the closet appeared as if it hadn't just been abandoned, but broken by force. In an effort to move on without further disturbing the broken shrine, he decided to put it back and simply pretend that he'd never found it, even though the whole thing gave him a distinctly bad feeling. But despite his attempts to put the discovery behind him, strange things began to happen around the building in the days and weeks that followed. Both he and his team began to hear disembodied voices and footsteps with no possible source to speak of, and everything from their ventilation fans and plumbing to the lighting and electrical system as a whole began to experience consistent and ongoing malfunctions. Flies began to gather in their unit's kitchen despite the fact that they didn't even use it, much less leave garbage or food around that could attract them. The entrance and soon whole first floor began to smell like sewage, a stench that eventually got so bad that he went to investigate its source. After finding that the entire floor was completely vacant and the unit the smell was coming from was inexplicably unlocked, he mentioned his findings to his assistant, who then investigated further himself. Upon closer inspection, he discovered that the unit's floor was full of holes where tiles were missing, and despite it being on the first floor with no basement underneath it, the holes were too deep to even see the bottom of. Another of Nakayama's assistants, upon hearing about this seemingly impossible abyss beneath the ground, decided to check it out herself, promising to shine her phone flashlight into the hole and report back to them on what she saw. That never happened. Instead, she never showed up to work again, phone, and no matter how many times Nakayama called her, the best he could do, when she never answered, was leave voicemail after voicemail that, just like the calls, were met with no response. This wasn't the first time something strange happened to one of his assistants either. Many reported seeing strange things like shadow figures in hallways when the building was empty, people standing outside bathroom doors only for no one to be there when they're opened, and a crow inexplicably sticking its beak into an office window only to disappear when she pointed it out to Nakayama, who was baffled to realize that the window was not only shut, but it was covered by a railing that no bird could get through. It appeared that every assistant he had in that building would experience some of these inexplicable events firsthand, prompting almost all of them to either quit outright or simply stop coming to work, many of whom were allegedly never heard from again. After 6 years of these strange occurrences and an odd, alarming altercation with his landlord who suddenly began acting very strangely out of nowhere, Nakayama finally made the decision to leave the eerie building behind, moving to a new office, but not before experiencing what he describes as a strange physical phenomenon while cleaning out a closet, something he refuses to elaborate upon further for, quote, his own reasons. After a smooth move to the new office, he finally decides to open up and tell his assistant about all of the strange things that happened at the old building, presumably assuming that they were safe from whatever was responsible in their new workplace. But as he started getting into detail about those experiences, his mouth started smelling inexplicably bad, getting progressively worse the more he shared. By the time he got to the part about that strange physical phenomenon, the smell was so bad that it was completely unbearable, and 2 days later, his gums began to bleed. Unfortunately, as alarming as that was, it was just the beginning. Directly after illustrating a chapter of Koisho Radio in which a character vomits blood full of spider-like creatures, Nakayama himself began to cough up blood. Blood blisters that he describes as black and gelatinous had formed all over his lips, tongue, and gums, which were bleeding profusely and continuously. He found himself covered in concerningly dark bruises, and started seeing blood in both his urine and his stool. Naturally, he went to the hospital, where upon receiving his test results, his doctor told him with no room for argument that he needed to admit himself immediately, because his condition would be fatal if it continued to progress untreated. As it turned out, his blood contained virtually no platelets. While a normal, healthy platelet count is roughly within the range of 356 and 127, his count was 2. And without platelets, his blood couldn't clot, leading to the subcutaneous bleeding that was likely responsible for the blood blisters and increasingly numerous and prominent bruises. This condition is called ITP, or idiopathic thrombocytopenic purpura, and while doctors were unable to pinpoint what had caused it, it was so severe that he had to remain hospitalized for over 2 months to treat it. After being discharged, he hoped that that would finally be the end of it, intending to speak no further on the matter. He'd already shared and illustrated his experiences thus far in the published chapters of Koisho Radio, and very reasonably wanted to put them behind him and simply move on. I can't imagine a near-death experience like that is something anyone wants to dwell on, especially because he had already wondered quite extensively at this point if it may have been connected to the manga story. But unfortunately, his hopes for a peaceful resolution were dashed, and his suspicions of a real curse were only given more and more credence. At this point, he had already made the decision to stop sharing these events publicly, but as strange and inexplicable things continued to happen whenever he worked on the manga or mentioned his experiences to others, he felt that he had to break that silence to investigate a theory. And that theory is the basis for the widespread belief that Masaaki Nakayama was not only cursed by his own art, but forced to stop using it to tell the story of Koisho Radio at all for his own safety. The theory that something dangerous wouldn't let him. By now, he had all but confirmed that these experiences had inspired at least some of the manga stories. After being released from the hospital, he mentioned that while he was obviously uneasy about the entire experience, he was admittedly grateful for the material as a horror mangaka. It's not hard to see the similarities either. Shadow figures, disembodied footsteps, even menacing crows whose visits appear to coincide with seemingly supernatural events. All of these things are present not only in Koisho Radio, but in Nakayama's accounts of his own real-life experiences. It's when he starts sharing them directly rather than simply taking inspiration from them, however, that he notices something concerning. Even though he'd moved from the building that he thought was responsible for it all, every time he tried to share his experiences, bad things would happen without explanation. On the day that a magazine published the issue of Koisho Radio that contained the chapters in which he illustrated what he'd gone through, a talisman on his ceiling suddenly peeled off and fell onto the table. On the same day, before attending an event at which he was going to discuss the story, all of the clocks in the office froze, flickered, or went haywire in a mass malfunction, even though all of them started working fine again afterwards. Directly after telling a friend everything that had happened, that friend came down with a high fever, had the back wheel of his bike completely wrecked as if a car had hit it without any incident or damage to cause it, and then broke his arm. His editor persuaded him to share what was happening in his manga again, even though he wasn't initially comfortable with the idea, and the ceiling started leaking as soon as he agreed to. It wasn't just odd occurrences either. He realized that no matter how recently or extensively he told someone he knew about his experiences, they couldn't seem to remember. It was as if they could only vaguely recall the events that he described, even when he reminded them, like something was stopping them from remembering. And whatever it was, it might have been doing it for their own good, because he continues that the few that could remember clearly all seemed to end up getting hurt or sick. sick, or even going missing altogether, including many of the assistants I mentioned earlier who quit or disappeared. In fact, according to Nakayama, every assistant that experienced or witnessed something strange or supernatural either fell ill or stopped coming to work, especially if what they'd seen was what he calls the black thing. He doesn't describe it in much detail, but does mention that the strange physical phenomenon he wasn't comfortable sharing also involved it, suggesting that whatever it was, the experiences he had with it were beyond what he was willing to disclose publicly. The last straw came when finishing production of a draft of Koisho Radio, his body temperature plummeted and half of his face began to swell up like a balloon. The hospital found nothing wrong and he was given no answers as to what had caused the sudden development. But inexplicably, when he scrapped and rewrote the chapter, presumably to revise or remove certain things that he'd included, he completely recovered. It was shortly thereafter that he made the decision to finally stop sharing his experiences altogether, openly concluding Koisho Radio with a panel implying that the manga itself wouldn't let him say anymore, and a statement that reads as follows: "This will likely really be the last time I talk about this subject. I'd rather not have to go through any more trauma like this, so I've decided to stall, or rather abandon, any further inquiry altogether. Thank you for understanding." And despite never receiving a conclusion, a cancellation, or even an announcement of a hiatus, that was the sudden and permanent end of Koisho Radio, with no further chapters released to date. It's no surprise then that most of those who know of the manga believe its artist had to abandon it for his own safety after being seemingly cursed not to speak of his experiences further. It is, after all, the belief he himself seems to hold and share directly through those final pages. Once the story reached Western audiences, as Koisho Radio was translated into English and sold to manga fans worldwide under the now better-known name PTSD Radio, reporting on those events got exaggerated. Articles upon articles claiming that Nakayama quit his entire career as an artist and mangaka just to save his own life from this cursed story flooded online spaces, and that quickly became the narrative that many believed to be true. Time and closer investigation, however, have revealed a different story altogether, and a much more complicated one, which finally brings us to the answer to the question I've been promising for almost half an hour now. Was Masaaki Nakayama really cursed by his own art? Maybe. I know that's an anticlimactic answer to give you after putting you through half an hour of context and build-up, but let me elaborate. All of my research, and trust me, there was a lot, points to the story he told in the manga actually being true. Lots of people have speculated that this was all a big publicity stunt like the viral marketing campaign for the Blair Witch Project, in which the fictional narrative it depicted was shared as if it was real. And I'll admit, when I read it the first time, that was exactly the conclusion I came to. A mangaka writing a story about a curse starts writing chapters about how he himself is ostensibly being cursed in real life. That sounds too coincidental to be true, and I'm enough of a skeptic that my immediate assumption was that he either exaggerated the truth or fictionalized the entire thing to accentuate the story he was telling. That didn't come from a place of judgment either. I wouldn't even be critical of someone doing that, because quite frankly, that kind of viral marketing and storytelling is effective, and whether it's true or not, it makes for a sincerely intriguing and engaging story. But I'll be the first to admit that I'm pretty sure that initially skeptical assessment was wrong. Fact-checking a story like this isn't something that can really be done effectively. It's not like I can investigate conclusively whether or not these events really took place, since finding proof of supernatural occurrences is difficult enough that even BuzzFeed Unsolved and Watcher still haven't succeeded, and finding more documentable proof of things like Nakayama's hospital stay is both legally impossible and a massive invasion of his privacy. Equally unhelpfully, the vast majority of articles reporting on this topic don't share any credible sources verifying the claims they're making. That in mind, my only real option left was to spend 5 to 7 business days stalking Nakayama's Twitter. So that's what I did, and honestly, 5 to 7 business days well spent, because it was the final nail in the coffin that convinced me I was wrong, and that there might be a lot more truth to his story than I first thought. Every single time he talks about any issue that contains one of the chapters detailing his experiences, he specifically refers to those stories as true, as real ghost stories about things that really happened to him. I wasn't able to find a single tweet suggesting otherwise either. Obviously though, whether it was true or a publicity stunt, he would probably be saying that either way, so I couldn't just take that at face value, and I didn't. I started looking back at his tweets from around the time that he claimed all of these strange occurrences started happening, that being roughly 2017 to 2018, and they sincerely seem to corroborate his story. He shared his experiences with the fever and the bleeding and the hospitalization there before illustrating them in the manga, speaking quite openly about his health issues and updating his audience and fans regularly on any developments to reassure them that he was okay. He documented years worth of dealing with the health problems he shared in the manga, with enough detail and evidence that I wholeheartedly believe that his experiences themselves were real, even if it can't be said for sure that they were caused by something supernatural. And again, while there's no way to confirm whether or not a supernatural curse like the one in his manga is responsible for those health problems, there is, at the very least, a lot of evidence to suggest that he sincerely believes it was. Not only does he always refer to these events as true ghost ghost stories, he even responded to fans at the time of sharing these health problems, suggesting that his writing and illustrating the story was truly connected to them based on the timing. He himself has said that he didn't want to believe that they were linked together, but still couldn't help but feeling like it was telling him not to talk about what he was experiencing. So yes, it's entirely possible that even if he didn't make up these experiences, he did exaggerate them and deliberately misrepresent them as the result of a real curse, or haunting, to build more hype for Koisho Radio. It could absolutely be viral marketing. Many have theorized that he simply realized the best ending for a manga so deliberately ambiguous and vague would be no ending at all, but rather an equally ambiguous and abrupt cancellation that keeps readers guessing as to whether or not supernatural forces were truly keeping him from finishing it. Koisho Radio is a story of a curse that spreads prolifically for reasons that are largely obscure and unknown, with mysterious events and inexplicable, horrifying experiences occurring as a result of simply interacting with a person or object that's already affected by it. Even something as insignificant as accidentally disturbing that cursed object. His account of his real-life experience is the story of a man who accidentally disturbed a mysterious object with spiritual significance, and, as what he implies is probably the direct result of that, was subjected to inexplicable, horrifying events that worsened and worsened the more he discussed them, even going so far as to suggest that his story, like the curse of Okushi-sama, might be contagious. Those similarities are striking, and I understand why people think it's less likely that his real experiences inspired the story, and more likely that the story inspired him to exaggerate his real-life experiences so that he could intertwine them into the narrative and make it more memorable. And I can't say for sure that that's not true. I also can't disprove the other claim that not only was it all a publicity stunt, but Nakayama didn't even cancel the manga for his own health at all, but rather solely because the magazine that was publishing it was cancelled. It was, but according to his tweet on the matter, Koisho Radio was picked up by a digital distribution site immediately afterwards, where it was continuing to be made available. So I don't believe that that's the whole explanation, if any explanation at all. Personally though, what I can say is that I don't believe that that was the case. I believe that Masaaki Nakayama did honestly experience the strange occurrences that he detailed in his manga, and I also do, perhaps naively, sincerely believe that he did stop writing it largely to prevent any further occurrences after so many of them up until that point were so damaging to his health. Everything I found suggests that at least that much is likely to be true, and that's exactly why I find the sensationalized misreporting on this topic so frustrating, because it shed a lot of unnecessary doubt on something that I believe was a real person's real experience. Whether it was truly because of a curse and a story that unknown forces didn't want him to tell or not, I don't doubt that Nakayama's account of what he experienced is largely, if not entirely, true. It could be a coincidence. It might be completely unrelated to anything ghostly or otherworldly, but I feel confident in saying that it did happen. But because Western news outlets were so ridiculously dramatic and exaggerated about their coverage, they made it sound unbelievable, and as a result, a lot of people thought it was. Manga artist quits his whole career over his cursed art that almost kills him. No one knows what happened to him after. Like, yeah, that sounds fake. It's also not what happened. He did not quit his entire career. He's still actively writing and illustrating his main manga, Fuon no Tane, and is alive and well, posting regularly on Twitter. He even retweeted one of those articles with unbelievable headlines saying something along the lines of, "Is this what happens overseas?" Further mentioning in the replies that he thought it would be best not to make any rude attempts to correct their misreporting, and that he feels that misunderstandings sometimes prompt creative results, so it's fine. But honestly, I think he was being a lot more understanding than he needed to be. Ostensibly, he's a guy that shared his real, potentially supernatural experiences in a horror manga, and stopped writing that horror manga because he felt like it might be connected to those experiences and he couldn't handle any more of them, so he wanted to err on the side of caution. Western media took that and turned it into a ghost story narrative where he was so cursed by his own art that not only did it directly almost kill him, he had to give up his entire career just to escape its wrath, and has stopped writing and drawing altogether for his own safety. His work became known for that urban legend and not for its value as a story and a piece of art, and people internationally began to believe that he was no longer making manga, something that can't be helpful to a professional mangaka still very active in his career, that he was missing or outright dead, or that he made the whole thing up for publicity. None of those things are, in my opinion, true, and having people just take the media's word for that for so long couldn't have been a pleasant experience for him. Obviously, I find this whole story interesting, otherwise I wouldn't be covering it. A man ostensibly cursed by his own art to the point that inexplicable, traumatic, real health experiences prompt him to stop making it is a memorable story. It sparks curiosity and intrigue. It sparked mine. But the more I dug into the truth of the matter, the more it made me sad that that story so quickly became all that Koisho Radio and Masaaki Nakayama were known for amongst Western fans. Overblown misreporting and language barriers created so much more hype and interest in that sensationalized story than the exceptional art and story expressed through his manga, which was pushed aside as largely an afterthought. Were this artist's experiences truly caused by something supernatural? Something that threatened his life just to stop him from telling his story? I don't know. Maybe. I don't think any of us will ever know for sure. But does that take away from the significance of the wonderfully terrifying, intricate, fascinating art and story he created with Koisho Radio? Absolutely not. And you should all go read read it and support him because he truly deserves it. The link to both his Twitter and the Kodansha site hosting his manga are in the description. Thank you guys not just for watching, but indulging my horror obsession yet again as I use Halloween as an excuse to ramble about it. Special thank you as always to channel members Joseph Solomon, TC Pratt, Zelda Deverak42, Haruki Saluzzo, King Good James, CP Little Thing, Art of Amethyst Fable, Extinction Animation, and Indy the Hedgehog, as well as patrons Batman, Kyle Lowe, Blue Swanson, Cora Fear, Jamisha Walker, Alengshi, Kim Yen, Crazy Asar, Gentong, Graceling Xavier, Blah Mage, TC Pratt, Finn, Celine Merriman, Ash, Eldritchia, The Stray Dog, Ulura, Greg Noble, Dekugan, Jenny Chan, Cat Bus, Mac, Lucy Yamajiki, Selena Beebe, Pride Day, Totally Shogun, Insomniac Sleep Schedule, Wing Tang Wong, and Marie Greer. And I'll see you in the next one.